yeah, a few words about Christian. So Christian is an associate professor at the Employment Relations Research Center at the University of Copenhagen. And until recently, Christian was also associate professor at Michigan State University, which is, I guess, where you conducted this research during that time. So, well, I guess it's great to get a sort of live insight into the picket line, and I guess you talked to a lot of the striking workers there, and it will be interesting to hear about the UAW strike at General Motors in 2019. And oh yeah, Christian, you're no stranger to the East Midlands, right? You did your MA at Warwick University, so I don't know if you had a chance to visit back, but so welcome back. And well, that's all I have to say. I hope I got all of that right. And so, Christian, I don't know if you would want to wait a bit more whether Maite will come or whether you just want to get started right now.
No, I think Maite might actually be dropping off kids at the moment right now as we speak. So yeah. I think we should just start, and maybe she'll join later. All right. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to your seminar, and thanks for willing to listen to this study that we did already now 3 years ago, actually. But on a topic that is, I guess, very close to your home right now, on the strikes that we saw in 2019 between the United Auto Workers and General Motors. Hi, Maite. So this is work that I did together with Maite Tapia, who just joined us, and Phil Diotentis, and Carla Lima, who is the lead author. I don't know if Carla will be joining us today because she is doing field work right now on the organizing of Amazon workers. I forget which state it is. Maite, can you?
In Alabama.
In Alabama, yeah.
You know.
So she's doing field work for her PhD there, but this is collaborative work that we did, and she's the lead author of the paper. But I agreed to present it. Okay, so we're basically asking the question if atypical workers are act in solidarity with atypical workers, and we use survey evidence in this study or in this paper. To look at this question. Just a bit of background for the study. So just so you know where in which setting that this strike took place. So in the US, in the automotive industry, you've had for a long time in the post-war period, you've had a system of pattern bargaining where the UAW would sort of pick out one of the big three auto companies, so that's Ford, Chrysler, and General Motors, to see which one they would negotiate with first, and then that agreement, if ratified, would then set the pattern for the other companies, and then effectively sort of set a going rate, if you will. For the automotive industry in the US. So back in 2019, the UAW picked out GM based on soaring profits, or soaring. I don't know if they were soaring, but they were definitely much higher than they had been in the past, and went into negotiation with GM first. Now that negotiation broke down. There were demands from GM to sort of cut on healthcare. There was also talks about increasing the use of atypical workers or temporary workers. And finally, the UAW sort of said, well, you guys are definitely able to pay a better deal than this. So they went on strike on September the 15th in 2019, and about 48,000 UAW members went on strike. So this was sort of a nationwide strike against GM. It lasted 40 days, which was the longest nationwide strike against GM since the 1970s, since 1970, and was the first national strike since 2007. And we also found it extremely interesting that this was the first strike that was very explicitly about the progression of atypical workers to typical terms and conditions of employment. So this really sparked our interest. Another reason why it also sparked our interest, and this is really Maite's work, is that it really was a great opportunity to revive some old ties that Michigan State University had with the UAW. So this is just a Google Maps of how close we actually are to the plants. So this is South Kedzie on the right-hand side is where I used to work, where Maite still works, and where Phil and Carla work. So it was basically a 6-mile drive down to the picket line, and we thought, or Maite initially thought, that this was really a good opportunity to sort of make some links between academia and the unions in Greater Lansing area. So Maite went down to the picket line and started asking the folks on the picket line what the main issues were, how they were feeling, how they were doing. You brought them donuts and coffee, I remember, with your 2 daughters, right? So if you've been on the picket line, you know that small gestures from the local community is also something that is really, really important. There was a lot of support from the local community to this strike. And one of the key issues, of course, there might be a sort of a local community feelings, but another issue was also the fact that the UAW had successfully framed the existence of manufacturing jobs as a key precondition for economic development in the Lansing area. So there were talks about how many jobs a GM job would actually mean for the local community. How many jobs would that create in the community? And conversely, if you lost the GM plant, you could see a lot of deterioration of the local community economy. So there was a lot of community building around this strike, and I just mention it because we're doing other work that is not just about survey evidence and the particular focus from this paper, but also the sort of greater role of the UAW and the strike back in 2019. So we asked the research question, so to what extent will typical workers act in solidarity with atypical workers? This was sort of one of the key issues that we heard down on the picket line, that the typical workers were really sort of saying, well, this is the time where we need to normalize the conditions for atypical workers. And I'm just giving you a timeline here of what happened. So in September 16, the work stopped, and during that time we went down to the picket line and started creating a survey that we could ask the workers about. So study 1 was about the motivations for being on the strike, and I'll show you a little bit about how we gathered the data there. Then the voting started. Eventually, there was an agreement, and that agreement was then ratified by members in October, late October, and then October 26th, the GM plants resumed work. After that, we then did a second follow-up study about the motivations for voting yes or no to the agreement. So we have 2 surveys, right? And I'll tell you more about these 2 surveys. So when we were down on the picket line, as I said, we heard more about how the work had been the work in the plants had been restructured over the years, especially starting in 2007 with an agreement that you would introduce new tiers, lower tiers for new hires. Okay, so this is, you know, akin to what we know from academia, where you start off as a postdoc, and then you get another postdoc, and then you get a fixed term contract, and so it goes, right? And it goes on and on and on, right? This has a very a long history in manufacturing also, and we're up to 4 tiers at least. You could argue that there are even more, but 4 tiers, where tier 1 is sort of the typical open-ended production worker contract. Tier 2 is the people, the folks who've been hired after 2007 and are in progression, meaning that they will eventually, hopefully, get into a typical contract, but right now they're at a lower tier. They're doing the same work, but they're simply hired at a lower level. Then you have fixed term, temporary workers, that's tier 3, and then you have the flex temp workers, which have varying working time, working hours, but also are sort of called in on demand, right? And so there's quite a lot of tiers in the plants. Just a note on the actual agreement, because that's kind of important to know the context of study 2 about the ratification. So this is the nationwide figures, where 57% of the workers were in favor of the contract, and it did improve some of the conditions for tier 2 workers. It shortened the path to 3 years to give permanent status for the atypical workers to get the permanent status, and also it gave the unions oversight of the use of temporary workers, so the unions would get an idea about how many are there at the plants, is it too much, etc., etc. There was also an increase of wages for second-tier workers to $32, equivalent to tier 1 workers, in 4 years or less, rather than what it had been 8 years. Okay, so this all looked quite good on paper, but as I will show you, it fell short of what the union had actually demanded, and especially what a lot of the in progression workers had wanted. And then there were some very nice material or extrinsic wins for the members. So a ratification bonus, a 3% general wage increase, and the maintenance of the healthcare plan. So that demand that GM had come forward with of reducing the healthcare plan for workers, that was scrapped in the final agreement. But as I said, the agreement fell short of the UAW demands. So it was not a return to the pre-2007 situation. There were still a lot of tiers. And maybe also more importantly is that it is not certain that atypical workers will qualify. It's not certain that they will actually transition into the tier 1, right? Well, because some will leave. And then they will return without and sort of be reset in a sense, right? So this is of course a big problem for a lot of workers. If you don't accrue the seniority to qualify for some of these provisions, then it doesn't really matter that much, right? So there was a lot of criticism around the talk, and some of it was real. And some of it was also sort of perceptions of the contract that the UAW leadership had to sort of discuss with the rank and file to eradicate any misunderstandings. But at the end of the day, what was important was that there was a lot of discontentment about the agreement on the progression of atypical workers. Okay. So that's sort of the context of the study, and now I'll just go a little bit over to some of the sort of the framing issues and how we looked at this from a theoretical point of view. So the first is that we framed it in solidarity terms. We were looking at the ways in which collective actions that could improve the working conditions of others while accepting status quo or in rare instances, worse conditions for yourself, we considered those as being clear expressions of solidarity, right? So to put that in a more easy way, essentially we were saying, well, are the typical workers striking to improve the conditions of the atypical workers, right? And this, of course, needs to be set into the context of this multi-tiered workforce that I just talked about. So tier one, the traditional workers acting in solidarity with tier two workers, right? The ones that are hired after 2007. Okay, so that's really what we're talking about here. Okay. We then looked at the literature that has been written on this issue, and a lot of so we come from an employment relations or an industrial relations tradition, right? So there might be other work in the sociology of work or political economy that will have different findings and different theoretical propositions, but our point of departure is the employment relations literature. And a lot of it has sort of been about documenting dualization and segmentations of labor markets and how it affects workers, right? And there's sort of a strand of that literature that looks cross-nationally a lot, but also across industries to document these trends. And it's fair to say that in many countries you can document this trend. And then there's been a lot of work done on exploring and explaining union responses to atypical workers, and we engage with that literature quite a lot. And I'll go into detail with that in a while. But there's not been a lot actually on typical workers' perceptions, right, or opinions or actions as regards to atypical workers. So those sort of individual level actions or perceptions there's not a lot on that in the IR literature, which is something that our study then might fill in this gap. And we also thought that it was very fitting to look at a strike, because a strike is sort of the ultimate testbed for solidarity, at least in employment relations, because that's where you really sort of you get into conflict, but you're also able to show what is important for you when you strike, but also what is important for you when you finally vote on an agreement. So we looked at elsewhere to sort of devise some hypotheses, and the sort of the very clear point of departure for a lot of this literature is the insider-outsider model, or dualization literature in labor economics, which essentially sort of argues that that atypical workers or in various ways, it could be fixed-term workers, agency workers, part-time workers, they serve employer needs in times of increased demands for flexibility. So if you think of a market that has been liberalized, where you need to adjust your workforce much more rapidly than you did in the past, it really makes a lot of sense for employers to demand more flexibility, and employing these kinds of atypical workers serves that purpose. But then you get into this issue of dualization, or the divide between different groups of workers, because atypical workers can then fill this flexibility needs during hard times while you're still protecting your typical workers. And of course, you know, you get sort of this classic idea of core workers that you want to hold on to, and then the peripheral workers, the atypical workers that you can dispose of and hire in as your organization demands it, right? And then there's a strand within that literature that is basically arguing that unions, being very insider focused, will usually enable or even create dualization as they protect insiders, right? And in some sense, the 2007 agreement that allowed more tiers at GM can be seen in this light. Why did the UAW agree to putting in new tiers? Well, they did it because they wanted to protect their core workers, their core union members, right? So some Some workers had their terms and conditions protected. They did not have to engage into concessionary bargaining, but for new hires, you introduce new tiers to fill the flexibility demands. Okay, so counter to that idea, you have the union strategy literature that, to varying degrees, argue that unions have more strategic choices, and they actually do much more than the dualization literature says that they do. And increasingly, unions have become outside of focus. So they're not just focused on their core workers and their core members. They're also looking at the broader picture and how the atypical workers are a constituency that they need to organize, but also B, that the mere existence of atypical workers is actually a threat to the core workers, not a complement to core worker interest. So under certain conditions, unions, so that's the sort of point of departure, that unions are generally not creating dualization, employers do. But the other thing is then to look at the conditions under which that unions can diminish dualization, and there's sort of a lot of the usual suspects. So high union density is very good. If you have encompassing unions, you're able to diminish dualization, but you also need including union density, union identity, and supportive institutional supportive institutional settings. So think of the Nordic countries where I'm from, right? And core workers are increasingly becoming more solidaristic. That's also an argument made by people like Chiara Biazzi and Lisa Dorigatti that core workers are actually becoming more solidaristic. Maybe they're doing it out of self-interest because they're trying to protect themselves, but in any case, they actually care about atypical workers. We then argue that, well, solidarity, these are sort of general issues, but a solidarity during strikes is actually also very situational, right? So I probably, you know this better than I do, given that you're actually living a strike right now. But solidarity can be very situational. So you can have very high solidarity during strike rituals. So when you meet down at the union hall, you talk to each other. You're at the picket line. You get emotionally aroused when you see other people who are fighting the same cause, right? But that emotional energy can also be low as the strike drags on, right? And the strike fatigue sets in. You also start thinking about opportunity costs that become very real. You don't get paid the same. You don't get paid. Maybe the strike funds are running out, and maybe employers are sort of offering benefits for the typical workers that would sort of say, okay, well, actually, I'm going to personally lose out a lot of money if I don't stop the strike, right? So these things have sort of, solidarity can come and go, especially when we're talking typical and untypical workers. All right, so we then set up some hypotheses, right? And the hypothesis for study one during the strike is quite simply that insider status, and I'll talk a little bit about what we mean by that and how we operationalize that insider status is negatively related to solidarity reasons. So this is the simple dualization or insider-outsider model, right? And of course, we sort of fixate on the hypothesis that comes from that literature. Hypothesis two is that insider status is positively related to self-interested material or extrinsic reasons for being on the strike. So the fact that you would get a higher wage for yourself, but also job protections for yourself, etc. Right? So there's these sort of two reasons that we ask the members about. Then the hypothesis for study two are a little bit more elaborate. And here we're trying to explain why members would vote yes or no to the agreement, and keep in mind that the agreement fell short of the expectations for the the tier 2 for the atypical workers. So hypothesis 3 is essentially just that insider status is positively related to the individual's ratification vote. So by, on average, insider status will make you more likely to vote yes to the agreement, right? It had a lot of nice things for insiders, and it might have fallen short of the expectations on atypical workers, but you're willing to live with that. Hypothesis 4 is that if you really cared about solidarity with the atypical workers, you would be less prone to vote yes to the agreement for the reasons that I've said, that it fell short of the expectations. Hypothesis 5 is that if you really care about extrinsic reasons, you are more likely to vote yes to the agreement. And then hypothesis 6 is about mediation, right? So it essentially says that if you cared a lot about solidarity, even if you're an insider, then you would be less prone to vote yes to the agreement. Conversely, for the extrinsic, if you really cared about extrinsic reasons, you would be even more likely as an insider to vote yes to the agreement. Okay, so there's sort of a direct and indirect effects that we look at in the study. Okay, study 1. So here we went down to the locals, and this is local 652, where we asked the members to fill out the survey once they had collected their strike check. So that's the strike check that they got on a weekly basis to compensate for the loss of earnings. So we went down there and we did that, and we got a quite nice response rate. So 45% of the union members of the 2 locals that we went to filled out the survey, which equaled 1,556 completed questionnaires. We had a nice split between tier 1 and tier 2 workers, and we looked at we looked at sort of the key variables that we looked at here was insider status, which was a latent factor that we composed from your job tier, how long you had worked at GM, and then if you had ever been on a strike before. Okay, so all of these things go in together to produce what we would call an insider. Okay. Unfortunately, Phil is not here. He is the structural equation modeling guy that we. But I'll if you have any technical questions about SEM, I'll try to answer them, and if not, I'll pass them on to Phil in writing. Solidarity reasons were a latent factor variable that was made out of 2 items. So that was if you cared about the conditions of temporary workers, if that was the reason why you were on strike, and that was a Likert scale of 5. So going from yes, that mattered a lot to me, to no, that didn't matter at all, and then whether you cared about the wage structure, right? So that also was related to the improvement of atypical workers. So we call those solidarity reasons. And then we had some controls in there and ran the structural equation modeling to see whether these variables were related as we expected. Study 2, after the ratification, here we couldn't go to the local union hall anymore because people were back at work. So it was an online survey, and that significantly reduced the response rate. So now we're down to 310 completed surveys, which is equivalent of a 9% response rate. So obviously that makes it less representative of the total workforce in the 2 locals, but we looked at the distributions across key demographics and key workforce characteristics, and they were pretty fine and pretty pretty equal. We had a split of 285 that were our traditional contracts, and then 35 that were non-traditional. So more traditionals did survey 2. And the variables that we looked at was insider status, so the same as in study 1. And then we looked at solidarity reasons. We looked at the ratification, which is our dependent variable here. And then we looked at extrinsic reasons. So this was the ratification bonus and also the profit sharing, whether that mattered a lot for the vote that members ended up doing. And then we have some controls in there. And here again, we use structural equation modeling to analyze the data. All right. So just to the findings. So for whether or not insiders went on strike, we clearly see that there were a significant negative effect of being an insider and being on strike for solidarity reasons, right? So this might not be very surprising if you think about it, because after all, non-insiders would probably care more about this than insiders would. But we did see a significant difference here, and also the insiders cared more about the extrinsic reasons. So this was profit sharing, ratification bonus, etc. Right? So there were clear differences between insiders and outsiders when we ran this analysis. However, I will say that the general levels of solidarity, like just the mean scores on solidarity reasons, were quite high across different job tiers, right? So I think we'll get into this in the discussion, but I think it's important to say that yes, we have significant differences, but actually the levels when asked were quite high across the different tiers. If we then go to the second survey that we did, so this is where we would sort of say this is putting your money where your mouth is kind of study. We saw that in terms of hypothesis 3, so that insider status is positively related to the individual's ratification vote. Yes, it was. So insiders were more prone to vote yes to the agreement, as we had expected. Solidarity reasons, so people who had very high scores on solidarity reasons were also less prone to vote yes to the agreement. So that's hypothesis 4. And conversely, if you were very concerned about extrinsic reasons, you were also more likely to vote yes to the agreement. So this is also in line with what we expected. And then going to hypothesis 6, which was the mediation hypothesis. So whether solidarity reasons and extrinsic reasons mediated some of the effect of being an insider, we actually see that was also supported by the study. So if you were an insider but you really cared about atypical workers, you were also less likely to vote yes for the agreement, right? So that mediated the positive effect, if you will, from being an insider negatively. Conversely, extrinsic reasons, if you really cared much about the extrinsic reasons as an insider, you were even more likely to vote yes in the final agreement, right? So this also was supported in the data. So that's H6A and B that were both supported. So essentially, we had we had this sort of nice, but also maybe a little bit concerning findings where all of our hypotheses were actually supported by the data, and usually that's nice because then you get the results that you were hoping to get. But on the other hand, I guess, Maite, you can chip in here. We were maybe kind of hoping that it wouldn't turn out the way that the insider-outsider model and dualisation literature had sort of hypothesized, right? But we did actually find support across the 6 hypotheses. So then we started to discussing these findings, and we sort of said, okay, well, yeah, especially when it comes to the actual agreement and ratification of the agreement, it does seem that insiders do care more about the extrinsic reasons than they care about the solidarity reasons, so the terms and conditions of the atypical workers. So this is kind of support of the inside-outside and dualization literature. However, as I also said, there was a very general high level of solidarity, right? So we need to keep that in mind. And this is just to show you that the average expression of solidarity by tiers of workers, if you look at this, and this is not the same as our latent factor variable, the insider status. That's also more than the job tiers, right? But just to show you that actually, if you look at in progression, temporary workers, and traditional workers, all of them had very high levels of support, right, to being on strike for the terms and conditions of atypical workers, right? Then you add tenure, then you add whether you've been on a strike before, and then these things would look different, right? But essentially what we're saying here is that this was surprisingly high levels of solidarity during the strike, right? So this led us to sort of argue that solidarity really needs to be seen as situational. I mean, the level of solidarity can be very high during a strike, but when it comes down to voting, it might actually drop off a little bit, which is natural, right? People want to get back to work, not least because they need to get paid. But also, I think, and this is maybe even more important, you know, in the general IR literature, collective bargaining is a process, right? And especially for mature collective bargaining systems like the one you see between the UAW and the Big Three, these are mature bargaining systems where you have repeated bargaining rounds, and the UAW may return to progression of atypical workers in subsequent rounds, right? So this can maybe be seen in that light. This was sort of the first move towards the pre-2007 situation where you might be able to take away some of those tiers in the future. But also, and here we're sort of maybe apologizing the unions a little bit, that unions also face very heterogeneous constituencies, right? I mean, with very often conflicting bargaining demands, and it to some extent it makes sense that unions care about the majorities, right, or their median workers, right? Because these workers do want to get back to work, they do want to have nice wage increases, and they do want job protections, right? So how do you square that circle as a union? And we would sort of argue that the UAW actually they were successful in getting some traction on this atypical workers agenda, but they fell short of what especially the atypical workers were hoping for. And then I think also just to apologize the insiders or the core workers. I mean, getting back to work is a very legitimate preference. There is such a thing as strike fatigue, right? And there are also the very high opportunity costs associated to not being at work. I don't need to tell you about that. So in that sense, maybe this was the sort of the best that the UAW could do in the given situation. Yeah. All right. So that's the presentation. Thank you very much on behalf of Maite, Carla, and Phil. And we also want to thank the UAW for having been very generous with their access and yeah, I look forward to the questions or comments that you might have. Thank you.
Well, great, very much, Ben, for this presentation and So we have about, we have enough time, about 45 minutes, or depending on interest, even longer for questions. So it's also great to have Maite Tapia here. I hadn't introduced you before, so it's also an associate professor at Michigan State University. So two of the co-authors here, that's great. And yeah, in general, so you already said that as a contribution, it's great to see a study on individual attitudes of union members to complement the literature that looks at more sort of meso levels or macro levels on union solidarity or strategy, or institutional factors in the industry or in the country at large. And I think that, is an interesting venue for further research, also maybe looking at some of these interactions, maybe with union strategy or union identity. So you mentioned that in your paper, you say, okay, maybe something specific about the US context and the business unionism we see here. And sure, it would be great to read, follow your work, how you deal with these issues potentially if you get the chance. So it certainly also makes you slightly uncomfortable to look at your results with the outsider model. So making you think, hopefully I'm not one of these materialistic people who will vote in self-interested way in our UCU negotiations coming up. So maybe we can gather some questions and then either of you can respond. So I will so maybe you could raise your hands. I can already see Joseph having a question and another hand. I think I can only see Joseph's for now. So I'll hand over to Joseph and Ying for their questions for now.
Yeah, thanks a lot. It was a really interesting paper and a really interesting talk. And obviously there are parallels with what's happening in UK universities, including at Leicester. I think it was interesting for me actually just to comment, we're running two national disputes, one over pensions, which is quite wrongly seen as a sort of insider issue because it obviously affects early career people and so on, and a separate dispute over what we call the four fights, which includes casualisation, atypical contracts, workloads and so on. And I think it was quite surprising for the section of the union that the votes over the four fights were generally much more overwhelmingly for strike action than the supposedly insider issue of USS pensions. And there's probably some interesting work to be done looking at the different attitudes across different areas of the UCU towards these two different ballots. I think that's something we should return to. I suppose my question, which relates to that, is about the generalizability of this study. And I think that's at two levels. And it's it's a positive thing in a sense that the situational thing suggests these are not fixed in terms of the levels of solidarity and so on, that these are quite variable. But one of the obvious questions is a sort of occupational industrial structure that you're looking at. There's a very specific history to these sort of big Michigan car plants organized by unions. I would have thought there are very specific attitudes among older, long tenured workers who've been through a history of industrial action and so on. And I wonder how you could see that, to what extent can you see this as generalizing to other industries and occupations? Is it legitimate to make claims based on this elsewhere, or do you think it's just too specific? And part of this is thinking about some of the struggles in Britain. It's a political question whether you create an ethos of solidarity to some extent. I think about some of the London universities where there's been lots of support for groups of very, very casualised cleaners, for example, from sort of formalised lecturers, some of whom are actually on atypical contacts as well, but of a different kind. The second question was about how you described the difference between during the strike and after the strike. And obviously this is something that's been weighing on my mind quite a lot recently, but you describe it as a sort of ritualized union performance that leads to enthusiasm, and this enthusiasm leads to solidarity. But I wondered if we could go a little bit further than that. And you can put an argument that really workers are formed as a collective subject through struggle, that it's not just a question of the sort of ritualized performance, but it's through these struggles that workers begin to see themselves as a collective. There's something more material here than simply a shift in ideas. And if that is the case, isn't it also an issue of exactly how the strike is run? So to what extent is it under collective democratic control? To what extent is it run simply by the union officials? And to what extent do workers think that they have a capacity of winning these greater demands? Because surely that will affect the balance between solidarity and these kind of extrinsic demands. So it's situational in the sense you described, but there seems to be a broader situationality to it related to the way in which workers have actually forged through struggles into a collective. Okay, sorry, I'll stop there.
Do we collect questions or should we answer now?
Yeah, as you wish. Yeah, so you can answer now. Yeah.
Okay, Maite, do you want to chip in or?
Sorry, I'm trying to unmute with Teams. Hi, everyone. Yeah, those are really great questions. Just a couple of responses. In terms of the generalizability, we realize that there are limitations, right? Because we are now looking at a very specific manufacturing sector in the US that has this large history. But to our surprise, actually, we would say, as we also mentioned in the paper, it's almost like it's a least likely scenario of solidarity that is happening between typical and atypical workers, because the UIW in the US is often portrayed as kind of this business unionism in which, you know, members are very complacent and content, especially the insiders. So we would have expected much lower levels of solidarity with the temporary workers. But this also, that was to our surprise. So to a certain extent, we see this trend of people, and we heard that also on the picket lines, workers talking about how they had actually a really good contract, but they didn't want GM to turn into a temp workplace and therefore also push it towards a temp society, essentially. And again, that gets to that point that Christian mentioned earlier. Here, GM is really seen as a key actor in economic development, kind of at a broader level, right? There's this multiplier effect. So if GM now starts to increase their applications of temporary workers, that could actually then turn into like a low wage. Then we're turning from kind of good middle class wages to a low wage society driven by GM. So that's, I think, something that we might see actually across other workplaces as well, in which core workers are now realizing that we need to fight for this, because otherwise we're going to have more and more an increased kind of casual workforce. And we're going to go into a kind of low wage precarious society. That's on your first point of generalizability. And then on your second one, we did have in the survey questions about to what extent are you on strike because you feel pressure by your coworkers or by your union. So anything that gets at that kind of democratic element, do you do it because you want to get at these things like better conditions of temp workers, or are there negative reasons, like you feel like you have to, you don't really have a voice? And in fact, what the survey shows is that it was very low, almost zero essentially, on the point of do you feel pressure by co-workers or union leadership? So it was really shown that they went on strike because of the positive reasons they wanted to change, rather than there was just no democracy and they felt like that we don't have a voice and the leadership decided it.
Yeah.
No,
that was actually what I was going to say, Maite. So we're in complete agreement. But I think, yeah, I mean, take this as a case. We call it a case study, even though we're using a survey, right? I mean, this is a case study where you know, if we treat it as a least likely case study, then yes, I think, as we agree, as we argue in the paper, we would expect this to sort of you know, have like a Sinatra effect, right? Like if the theory can make it here, it can make it anywhere, right? Because it was a least likely case. But yeah, but I think in terms of the the ritualized strike enthusiasm. I think, and I don't know if you've looked at that section but we actually cite Randall Collins, who's a micro sociologist, and then Farber, who's a labor economist, in the same section, and that's a little bit, you know, I don't know, schizophrenic, right? At least in terms of discipline. But they kind of say the same thing, just from very different points of departures, right? The labor economists will say that there's opportunity costs, and those become very visible around the time of ratifying the strike, but also now you've been on a strike for a very long time, and it begins to really hurt, right? And then we could also see that among the members that we looked at. You know, they were like, 40 days, this is a long time, right? And the strike check will definitely not cover your lost income, right? But then there's this other thing where you could see very clearly that people were enthusiastic on the picket line, and there they would happily say that they were very, very concerned about their peers, and that they were doing the same job for a lot less, and with a lot less protections, right? We can't distinguish between those two things, but they both point in the same direction.
Right. Thanks. I think next was the Ying. You had a question.
Yeah, hello, thank you very much. I raised my hand pretty early on, but then I realized that some of the questions has been, so part of the question has been addressed in the previous responses. So that would sizably reduce my question to a limited scope, which is about the sort of like the kind of working relationship between typical workers and atypical workers in the context of the GM plant. Like, for example, I myself is a typical worker in the sorry again for using the higher education analogy, sector analogy again. But then, like, for example, I myself is a typical worker, and I do feel solidarity with atypical workers because the fact of them being atypical, or the fact of them not having job security, actually affect my job. So yeah, affect how I do my job. So I would struggle to, well, I'm not sure whether it would be considered a self-interest reason of going on strike in that sense. But then, yeah, I was just wondering whether the same kind of calculation, not really consideration, actually occurs in among typical workers who went on strike in GM. And it would be great if you could describe the relationship on the day-to-day working relationship between typical workers and atypical workers a bit more. Thank you very much.
Yeah, Michael, do you want to?
Sure, I can just say, maybe you could say from the survey, and just anecdotally, I can say when talking to, we went to the picket lines probably about 20 times. So we were there quite often, at least twice a week, over 40, so not 20 times, wrong calculation, but a lot. And we talked to the workers. And so they were talking, of course, about how many had a really good contract, but then work next to someone who did the same work, who's, for example, a temporary worker. So the idea of temporary workers is, of course, it's kind of double, right? On the one hand, temporary workers are hired to really address the influx and demand of production, right? So the idea would be to have seasonal temporary workers during the summer, for example. But what has happened over time with GM is that these temporary workers now stay on for a very long time. Some were there for 3 years, 4 years, and it's a really big difference. As a temp worker, you have a much lower wage, so where it's about $30 an hour and really good benefits if you're tier 1, a temp worker can go to, you go down to $10 an hour, $15 an hour, and have no benefits, no vacation day, no paid sick time. They can switch you to another shift overnight, etc. Right? So the difference is huge. So as the full-time workers, the tier 1 workers would first say, well, temp workers have been very useful for us because when we go on vacation or when there's an influx in demand, they can fill up that gap. But what they're seeing now is that they're being brought in for such a long time and being kept for 3-4 years that it starts to undermine and threaten essentially the good wages and benefits that tier 1 people have, right? So to your point, on the one hand, that solidarity can come indeed from, to a certain extent, an instrumental, a self-interest point of view of, if that keeps on going and we increase these temp workers, this is going to affect my very good kind of contract. But at the same time, they also would talk about how it's not fair, so kind of more value-laden reasons, how it's not fair that they work next to someone who does exactly the same work, but is paid a fraction and has no rights whatsoever. So you see, kind of anecdotally, at least talking to many workers, you see both reasons as to why they care about the conditions of temp workers.
Yeah, and I think I guess it's important to also say that the survey is limited in that sense. We can't distinguish between one or the other in the survey, right? We included political identification in the analysis also, and it turned out that the people holding liberal values, liberal in the U.S. sense, so think, voting Democratic rather than Republican. They would also score higher on the solidarity reasons. But again, does that mean that they're just more altruistic or whatever? We can't really say that.
Thank you very much.
Right, so I'll want to ask a question as well, or I think it's more like two questions. So one thing more at the micro level, I was sort of trying to get my head around is this dichotomy that you have between, voting in solidarity versus voting as material, and to what extent, they're really sort of distinct categories. And maybe that's something that's answered in your structural equation modeling that I didn't get, but sort of just thinking, can a temporary worker also vote in a more self-interested way by saying, I want to keep striking, basically? Or is it actually self-interested for an insider to say, no, we accept this deal after 40 days of striking, because it might be the most realistic way of doing things? So I think, maybe, I guess, if there was sort of more detail on the sort of union strategy in the paper, or maybe you're saving that up for something else, I don't know, that would maybe help with that, or just maybe trying to understand what's going on in the voters' minds when they make up their minds about, this choice. Is it really a materialistic or self-interested vote, or is it more a vote in terms of, does a vote yes actually mean, okay, this is a realistic vote, rather than sort of self-interested? And I guess related to that, so you cite, and when I looked at your paper, you have some of the political science literature, but then I guess I was expecting more, for you to talk about exactly these sort of, I don't know what the literature says on that, how voting behavior happens in the attitude formation in the individual minds, basically. So which points do voters usually weigh up, or just a bit more detail on this kind of process I was looking for. But I don't know where you're aiming to publish this at, so it might not be relevant. Okay.
Yeah, I guess to the last point, I think we're not sort of targeting political science journals with this paper, and if we had done that, we definitely should have said much more about preference formation and voting behavior. But it's a very good point, and maybe we do need to include some more on that, given that study 2 is about ratification of the agreement for sure. So that's that's a fair point. I think where we do sort of have a little bit on that is sort of trying to sort of say, well, at least in political science, you have the idea of a median voter, right? And here you have a median union member. And what does the median member care about? Well, they care about wage increases, job protections, healthcare plans, et cetera, right? At least in the typical literature. And whereas the conditions of atypical workers is sort of secondary or even tertiary to these demands, and I think what the study 2 shows us is that when it came down to voting, these things, they all mattered a lot, but the extrinsic material reasons mattered more. Okay, and if you're sort of thinking about your marginal, propensity to vote yes or no, then that might have been the sort of the key issues that pushed you over to vote yes, right? But we don't deal with that kind of studies, and but maybe we should, absolutely. And is it a dichotomy in the vote between solidary and versus material reasons, or is it, we can't, we can only say as much as the survey allows us to, right? And we sort of ask people to show us where, what was important for their vote, and there we do see clear signs of people who sort of think more in terms of the solidarity with atypical workers. They were dissatisfied and they voted yes, and the other folks who were more who thought the other items were more important, they voted yes to the agreement, right? So in that sense, it did seem to match up with what we say, which is these things have different logics, right? People who care about the atypical workers will care less about the sort of material or extrinsic reasons. So I might do it.
I think that's right. I agree with that, and I just wanted to. Unfortunately, I have to leave to another meeting, so I really wanted to thank you all, and I'm sure Christian will report back with the many more questions that you have. So thank you for letting us present the paper and for your great questions so far. Bye.
Thanks. So we have a question by Nick and Wen next. So yeah, Nick, you can go ahead.
Yeah, well, thanks, Christian, for that paper and the co-authors. Yeah, it's a lovely case in a way, I think. And I found it interesting how you kind of struggled with this dualization theory. And in a way, I like the fact that you struggle with it. And to me, it looked like the more context you add, kind of the more you relativize it, because there are issues of, in a sense, the culture of the whole place, the history of it. There's an issue of framing. Obviously, time and history play a role, and then it sort of looks probably less clear-cut than a brutal insider-outsider dualism. So, in a sense, you kind of say it probably, but I was wondering, is it just the starting point, the dualization theory for you? And I think it would be a very obvious starting point, given the case and well, other literature as well, obviously. Yeah, to what extent do you want to hold on to it at the end?
Yeah, thanks. I'm glad I think you coined the sentiments that we had, especially Maite and I. We've been arguing for a long time, along with other IR scholars, that unions are not sort of choosing dualization because they want to, right? I mean, they're doing it because they're forced to it, or maybe they're not even, maybe they don't even have a choice at all, right? So I think I think given, and this goes back to Joseph's point about the case and where you sort of find it in the grand universe of occupational groups and industries, this is really one of the key examples of the insider-outsider literature. Manufacturing, highly unionized, exposed to global competition, which leads to increased demands for flexibility, which leads to concessionary bargaining, which leads to multi-tiered employment structures, right? So in that sense, it is this sort of least likely case for finding solidarity across the groups, and maybe more importantly about the union strategy, right? I mean, I think the fact that the UAW chooses to make this a key issue is bold in a sense, right? But maybe it also is indicative of how the membership has moved during the last 15 to 20 years, going from I want to protect my job and I'm okay with introducing multi-tiers to save my terms and conditions, to the situation now where they're much more focused on the broader ramifications of introducing multi-tiers, and also the fact that this might erode, well-paid jobs in manufacturing over the long run, right? I mean, we heard anecdotes about managers also being hired in as temp workers now, right? So imagine that scenario, right, where your manager is there for 2 months and then they have to leave because they're no longer in that position. So there's clearly sort of a union push against casualization and dualization, and this is not just in the U.S. manufacturing setting. This also happens in Denmark, where I'm from. But I think it is the right point of departure. We have to acknowledge that we do find significant differences between the insiders and the outsiders on this, right? But I think, yeah, we really want to discuss this finding critically, and of course we're sort of we might get some reviews that tells us, listen, what are you actually arguing? Are you arguing that you side with the dualization, or are you arguing that you're not siding with it? And I think to some extent we need to be true to what the data tells us, and to some extent, yes, we're siding with dualization literature, but we also want to say that generally yes, people vote out of self-interest, but as I said, we also apologize that voting behavior, because that's natural, right? You want to get back to work, and you care about your own terms and conditions, but you can still have high levels of solidarity even if it is a secondary concern of yours. I don't know if that answered your question, but at least this is.
No, it's
yeah.
Thanks.
We had one more question by Wen.
Right, Christine, I add evidence for you from the UK, because I did a similar study in the manufacturing sector.
Okay. Could you please send that to us?
I need to discuss with you because I sent the paper to Wes. It was rejected. They don't like the framework.
Okay.
So I find the framework, so I probably can send to you for discussion. We can think about the way how to.
Mm-hmm.
Can you see me? It seems I You can't. Oh, right. I don't know why, because I tried to put my camera on, it didn't. But here I have one is a comment, one is a question for your methods.
Mm-hmm.
For the comments, I used a large data, about 7,000 reviewers. So I collect data from platform. You know, the job search recruitment platform,
Mm-hmm.
like Glassdoor, Indeed.
Mm-hmm.
So I collect data from there, from Jaguar, Land Rover, you know, Rolls-Royce, all the manufacturers. What I found the same. So the things which I put there is, you have this atypical worker, like you in your case. This atypical worker actually very highly skilled, which the situation was exposed in the strike by Airbus. There are 500 highly skilled engineers in Airbus worked for up to 10 years and wasn't given permanent contract. They were not entitled for furlough because it wasn't considered a permanent contract worker. So that caused me alarm to look at the data. One is those people. What I found is a typical worker, permanent contract worker, feel sorry for them because, so there are a lot of comments. They work to death, work to drop because it's so intensified.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other hand, they do feel job security is threatened by these highly skilled and atypical workers. So that's one. The other stream which I look at it is professionals, like you mentioned. We have these managers and even highly skilled engineers. They were hired as a consultant. Because for consultant, they can pay you, you know, 100 or 1,000 pounds a day, but only 3 days. So this consultant has a damage to the workplace is because business now rely on more from external labor market to acquire needed skills instead of in-house development. So typical workers and felt their career path was jeopardized. So that's why so I try to look at it from a social agent perspective. So look at it as a worker-place relationship. This fabric was damaged by such practice. And I matched up with companies' financial performance data and managed to show if you have a high percentage of a fixed-term contract worker, it's going to damage your performance, which is striking in Rolls-Royce, because 70% of their research and development, 40%, their research and development workforce are fixed-term contract workers. So which is in their financial report. So my issue is I haven't get the story clear. We can discuss how can I move this forward. For your question, for your research methods, because you said you use structural equation even modeling. Is not here because your dependent variable is binary, yes or no ratification. So you should use generalized structure equation evening modeling, because SEM is for continuous data. I was wondering how did he maneuver this with SEM, not GSEM.
So as I did sort of caution so thank you very much for both the comment and the question, and I would very much be very interested to see that your own study. That sounds fascinating. In terms of the research, the methods and the choice of structural equation modeling, I believe that that Phil did general structural equation modeling, GSAM, for study 2. So sorry for not specifying that.
Right. Yeah, I think study 2. If your dependent variable is a binary variable, you need to use GSEM.
Yeah.
Right. I will send you email and probably can
thank you very much.
With you.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm sorry my camera is on, but I don't know why I couldn't show. I actually dressed very smart today. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, was there anybody else? If not, maybe can I ask one last question just for clarification? Maybe you can just explain more about, I was really wondering to what extent, the workers in the union could have actually hoped for a better outcome. I mean, you said the demands were to completely abolish the 4-tier system. But I was just wondering, is that, is there precedent in maybe other firms or in a previous conflict in US automobile that would have led them to, realistically expect that? So what I'm just thinking is, so, voting yes, is that, more like a, just trying to get away from the insider outsider model again, right? So it makes everyone comfortable. Sort of, is that more a realistic response? Because I mean, there were some good terms in there, weren't there? That actually, from what you showed, that after 3 or 4 years, the temporary workers can get into the permanent contracts, and the pay will be adjusted. So there was also some. I guess we would be happy with these terms, I'm guessing. So I don't know if, to what extent does the union see that as a big loss or,
That's a great question. It gets back to the issue of context, especially historical context, right? I think the sentiment in the UAW membership, but also with leadership, was that that the 2007 agreement was really sort of an extraordinary agreement that was done at a time of crisis. And as you will remember, there was a bailout by the Obama administration of automotive companies, right, and GM included. And there was sort of an idea that, okay, these were hard times, there was a huge financial crisis, and GM was suffering, but now their profits are soaring. So now we need to get it all back. Right, and we've been abstaining and restraining ourselves for decades, even when profits were good. So now it's our time to get what is due. So seen in that light, you could totally see why people were dissatisfied with the final result. Another context, and I don't know if you're familiar with it, but the UAW was or has been through a very unfortunate corruption or embezzlement scandal with leadership, and so the leadership was really in a tight spot to deliver something for their members, right? And the president, the then president, has now actually been convicted for embezzlement, right? So there was a strong sort of demand from members to really deliver on this agreement in 2019. There were very high demands, and that's always the worst for a union leadership wants the opposite, right? They want great strategic leverage and very low demands from their unions, right? That's the perfect scenario, because then they can over-deliver. But here you had strategic leverage, yes, but you also had very, very high demands by members. But at the end, it was voted, it was ratified, and I think they could present it as a win, and only 2 locals, interestingly enough, one of the ones that we're looking at, one of the locals voted it down, So we're trying to see why that is the case. But at the end of the day, this was a win for the UAW in a time when when their leadership changed, and I think they're going to continue with this focus on atypical work. Atypical work is not going to go away from manufacturing, and I think the bargaining rounds in the future will have to deal with it as well, for sure. So I think, if they can convince rank and file that they're actually doing something about this and that they will continue to have a focus on it, I think, that will be the way to go forward. Yeah,
great, thanks. No, I didn't know about the corruption scandal. No.
No, I guess I shouldn't call it a corruption scandal. It's an embezzlement scandal. It's not corruption. So yeah. But nevertheless, in the U.S., this has been historically a huge deal, right? And it's been a problem that unions have to deal with constantly, right? Where their leadership is sort of delegitimized over and over again, both by its history, but also by things that come up again and again, unfortunately. And of course, it's a small minority of union leaders in the U.S. that engage in these practices, but it has such a damning effect for unionization in the U.S.
Great. So I can't see any other questions right now. I wanted to thank you, Christian. I hope you got some helpful comments out of it, and thanks for everyone who came a day after strike action. So Joseph also wanted me to remind you that we have our next seminar on March the 30th, and Sarah, who I think is here, is going to be presenting. Sarah Perez-Lozon, yes, great. And anyone who wants to be who wants to be on the CSWF mailing list, please email Joseph or Nick, or drop a line here and we can add you in. And I think unless you, Joseph or Nick, want to raise anything, that would be it for our meeting. So
no, just to thank again Christian and his co-authors as well for coming and presenting. It's a really fascinating paper.
Yeah, thank you so much, and I wish you good luck with the strike. And yeah, thanks for inviting me.
Great. Thanks everyone. See you soon, hopefully.